16th, 2022. As the midterm elections approach and campaigns are in full swing, advocates continue to note that with each new election cycle, there's a new opportunity to improve voter access for persons who are legally eligible to vote among the approximately 549,000 individuals in U.S. jails. It's noted that vast majority of persons in jails are eligible to vote because they are not currently serving a sentence for a felony conviction, but are incarcerated pre-trial or sentenced to a misdemeanor offense. However, many advocates say incarcerated voters often experience significant barriers to voting because of misinformation, institutional bureaucracy that varies from one county or city to another, and the deprioritization among government officials. In a 2019 op-ed, Washington, D.C. Councilman Robert White noted that when residents are convicted of a felony, they do not lose their citizenship or most of their rights as citizens, including the right to counsel and freedom of speech. White posed the question of why then have officials taken away their right to vote? Citizens are not allowed to vote in elections because they have felony convictions. In most states, there are underdeveloped practices for people incarcerated in prisons and jails to register or access absentee ballots and/or polling locations. Many incarcerated residents cannot freely communicate via phone or email with election officials to monitor their registration or ballot applications. Voter education for justice impacted citizens is often limited and varies across states and results in too many Americans being left behind each election season. Recent reforms and a growing civic infrastructure offer opportunities to strengthen voting access and ensure the franchise for every individual, regardless of their incarceration status. This morning, we discuss felony disenfranchisement laws in the U.S. with Patrice Sulton of the D.C. Justice Lab and Kentucky State Rep. Keturah, Herron, and also jail-based voter initiative organizer at the Sentencing Project, Durrel Douglas. But first, a couple of headlines to start your Tuesday. President Joe Biden plans to sign the Democrats' massive climate, health, and tax bill into law today at the White House, marking a major accomplishment for his domestic agenda less than 3 months before the midterm elections. Biden will deliver remarks and sign the bill known as the Inflation Reduction Act at an event in the White House's State Dining Room. Also this morning, as children are heading back to school this month, Kraft Heinz announced a recall of more than 5,000 cases of Capri Sun due to a possible contamination. This voluntary recall comes after the company announced a potential contamination affecting approximately 5,760 Capri Sun cases. Each case contains about 10 pouches of its wild cherry flavor. The company said a diluted cleaning solution was inadvertently introduced into a production line at one of its factories. The quote, best when used by date on the products is June 25th, 2023. That's June 25th, 2023. So if you see that on your Capri Sun, it is wise to either toss it or take it back to the store and get your refund. And now we turn our attention to felony disenfranchisement laws in the U.S. Let's welcome Patrice Sulton of the D.C. Justice Lab and Kentucky State Rep. Keturah, Herron, and jail-based voter initiative organizer at the Sentencing Project, Durrel Douglas. Good morning, all.
Good morning.
And good morning. I want to start with the representative out of Kentucky, Representative Herron. You ran, you took office earlier this year. You ran, part of your platform was this idea that an idea, but an agenda to restore the voting rights for these formerly incarcerated and those that are in jail, those with felony convictions. Can you talk about any progress you've seen?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me. So part of my platform was to restore voting rights to people who have past felony convictions. As of in 2019, we had over 300,000 people in Kentucky who did not have their right to vote. And so when Governor Beshear was elected, he did restore the voting rights to over 100 and 70,000 people for nonviolent felony convictions, but you're talking about leaving still a population of people out. In Kentucky, we are one of, I believe, now two states. I believe Iowa just changed their laws, but Kentucky and Virginia are two states that still forever disenfranchise people with a felony conviction. And so here in Kentucky, we believe that people have a right to vote, that their voice is needed. They are paying taxes. They are our neighbors. They're raising the next generation of children. And we believe that they should be able to participate in democracy. And so restoring the voting rights to folks with felony convictions is going to continue to stay on my platform until we're able to get that done.
Yeah, and I want to go to Douglas, Durrel Douglas. You support the Sentencing Project state and local jail-based voting coalitions and initiatives, moving the meter, as they say, on democracy. Douglas, what has driven your work and the Sentencing Project work? They've been doing this a long time as well. What has driven that advocacy?
So we know that in 2021, actually 19 states passed laws further restricting access to the ballot. So the Sentencing Project has a history of voting rights work. And so this is one of the major issues of today when we talk about expanding access to the ballot. There are some 549,000 people on any given day that are in jails and are actually able to vote in most of the states. But there's often not a mechanism to allow that to happen.
And I'm going to stay with you for one second. You also, I understand, was a lieutenant in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. So you got to see firsthand what goes on in, with incarcerated individuals. Talk about that a little bit and give us an understanding of how a scenario you can picture where they can vote.
Absolutely. One of the most rewarding and I would say enlightening experiences of my life was working in the Texas prison system for 5 years. Eventually, I left. Really quick story. It was time for them to turn out the field workers, and there you had some 200, mostly Black folks who were incarcerated wearing white uniforms, and you had maybe 10 white officers with shotguns, rifles on the back of horses, turning out the field squad. And it was reminiscent of like a scene from Roots. And it really made me question my role in the scheme of things, right? I thought I was being a fair lieutenant who was going to make change at the prison, but in reality, I found that I was actually contributing to this machine. And the machine is not fair. The machine takes away rights. The machine takes in people and puts them out, often far worse than they were when they came. When often it's the state Department of Corrections, often in their mission statement, they say rehabilitation is one of those goals. And everything that I saw for the 5 years that I was there did quite the opposite. One of those things is taking away the right to vote. When you take away a person's right to vote, you take away their right to decide who the judges are, who the district attorneys are, who the mayor is, what decisions are made. And if people are truly human beings, if we really want people to be contributors to not only the economy, but society as a whole, I believe the next step is making it universal, making the right to vote universal. It shouldn't be something that should be taken away, especially when we see the time and time again who it's taken away from overwhelmingly are people who look like me.
Yeah, and Patrice Sulton, DC Justice Lab. We know the DC Justice Lab has done a lot of advocacy work, a lot of hard work, and several different areas. But this is one also that we know that is near and dear to you guys. Talk about the work you're doing, and are we seeing progress from the DC Justice Lab's point of view? Are you guys seeing progress on this attempt to really restore these rights?
It's exciting to be on the other side of the spectrum from what we're hearing in Kentucky. DC joined just 2 states, Maine and Vermont, in allowing not only people with felony convictions to vote, but to vote while they're serving time in prison. The difficulty around the logistics of that are uniquely DC because we're not a state. And so people who are serving time for felonies here are scattered all over the country, thousands of miles from home in different places run by the Bureau of Prisons. But my hope is that as we solve that logistics problem for people who are there for DC related offenses, that we'll be able to solve that logistics problem for the BOP as a whole, and everyone who's serving time for federal offenses will also have a mechanism in place so that when it's time and we get to the point that everybody is allowed to vote from prison, there will already be an infrastructure there to do that. So I'm really excited to see DC leading on this issue and on some other reentry issues right now.
Yeah, and that's Patrice. That's interesting. The infrastructure is very important, right? Having that infrastructure in place.
Yeah, getting the ballots to people and getting them back and being able to count and keep track of, how many people are actually exercising their right from there is all part of the consideration in figuring out what's the best way to do this. And organizations like League of Women Voters and others have been really active in trying to make sure that people who are serving time not only know how to cast their ballot, but have answers to the questions that all voters have about what's on that ballot and what information they need to know in order to be able to make an informed choice.
Yeah, and Representative Herron, Kentucky is one of 3 states that have permanently disenfranchised people with felony convictions. What's the feeling within the legislature? Are you finding yourself fighting a one-woman fight, or do you have allies?
Yeah, so before I became elected in 2020, as an advocate, we were very close to passing a piece of legislation. Unfortunately, COVID happened, and a lot of the momentum for that piece of legislation, it died. And so there has been talks about folks wanting to get that done, but it's a matter of a political will, and we know what that looks like. And so the process now in Kentucky is, if you do have a felony conviction and you did not fall under the executive order, you are still able to petition the governor. However, we do not believe that individuals should have to have that burden and go through that long process. It is going to take 60% of our legislative body to agree upon restoring the rights, as this is part of the Kentucky Constitution. So once we're able to get a piece of legislation passed, we get 60% of our elected officials to say yes, then that will go on the ballot, and it's up to the people of Kentucky to vote whether or not we want that. I believe that the folks of Kentucky want it. And so one of the things that I've been telling our advocates is that we have to really focus on those communities where there's certain legislators who do hold a lot of power, who do not want this to happen. We have to focus on those areas and make it known that this is what Kentucky wants. And so it is a bill that I will file next session. So we will see what happens.
Yeah, and Representative, just staying with you for a moment there. You, like I said, this part of your platform, you ran with this issue. Why have you been so passionate about it?
I mean, honestly, I'm not someone who has always been engaged in the process of voting. I've always had my rights. I am someone who has been directly impacted with a couple of arrests. And I ended up taking a plea deal, and so I never had my rights taken away from me. But there's so many people around me, whether they're friends, families, or just the sheer number of people who don't have their right to vote. It's important. And now, as someone who is an elected official, I can tell the people that voting matters. It matters because we're able to get people like myself who know and understand the issues of the community to be able to be in seats to make sure that we are creating a commonwealth that is just and equal for everyone. And so that's the message that I'm putting out there. And, this is an important issue. Our voices matter. And if our voices are not heard, then we are going to continue to not have the things that we need in order for our people to thrive.
Yeah, and Durrel, people are, some people get dug into their positions. There's so many biases surrounding incarcerated or formerly incarcerated individuals. How do you get people to stop being people in power? To get rid of those biases, to even reason with them on this issue.
Absolutely. So there are actually things to point to that show where there's progress. One of those places is Massachusetts, where there was recently legislation passed and signed by their governor, basically telling sheriffs over jails in the counties that they have to provide an option for people to vote, that there has to be a polling place at these jails. We see it in places like DC, which is a very interesting take, because if DC can work through the bureaucracy and the scattered citizens across the United States, and working with a behemoth organization like the Bureau of Prisons, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, that means that there's no excuse across the nation for states to do this. And what we found is it's often not huge organizations that make this happen. There are smaller state organizations and individual organizers. There's a lady in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, who was able to get voter registration forms on a library card at the Minnehaha jail there in Sioux Falls. So as these things progress and as people see that the sky doesn't fall down when you allow people the right to vote, when you allow democracy to exist, more and more people and more states are going to see this as something that's not necessarily negative, but more so positive.
Yeah, Patrice, we also know that voters do have biases as well, obviously. But let me put it to you this way: when you put things out for the voters, an initiative, how do you think this would fare overall? Have you taken the pulse at all of how voters feel about this issue?
Well, what's interesting to me is that there is this really popular thing that we see across the US where people go into prisons and they ask folks, "Hey, you've engaged in this conduct. Help us come up with public safety reforms. Help us understand how violence happens and how to solve it." And so we've recognized that better ideas live there, right? And that this isn't just about the right of people individually to be able to vote. This is about our right to have them collectively participate in our democracy, to share their ideas and to have their voices valued and heard benefits everybody across the board. And so as we increasingly see this recognition of how important it is to talk to people with lived experience and who know things firsthand, that's part of it, is saying, let them contribute their ideas through this mechanism as well. And so I think it's really important for people to understand that there is a selfish interest there when we're talking about restoration of rights. And I oftentimes visit the Collateral Consequences Resources website. They do an outstanding job of putting tons and tons of information online, mapping out all 50 states, not just about voter reenfranchisement, but all of the different restoration of rights issues that exist for returning citizens.
Yeah, and also there's this education piece, right, for those who are incarcerated. They unless they have a felony conviction in most places, they cannot vote. But many are not in on felony convictions, yet there's a belief that they still can't vote simply because they're incarcerated. What kind of education? And I mean, I throw this to you, Patrice, but to the other two panelists here this morning that we're fortunate to have, Representative Herron and Mr. Douglas. What kind of education is needed? Is it being done to let people know, those who are in jails, that they can still vote?
I think that inreach is super important. We have a man here named Joel Castone, who actually was elected while serving in the DC jail as a commissioner for one of our advisory neighborhood commissions. And one of the first ideas I heard him speak about publicly when he was released was to have a civic engagement center inside the jail. And that's something that we jumped on right away and said, any way we can help with that, we want to do it, because that is so incredibly important to make sure that everybody understands what they're entitled to do and feels like they have the resources needed to be able to exercise that right responsibly and in their own interest.
Yeah, and Representative Herron, in Kentucky, can you speak to the education piece that might be going on to help folks understand that what their rights are and how you can overcome this? Really, it's what is it? Suppression, right?
Yeah, a lot of the education that we're doing is the long, hard work is going in communities and talking to people one-on-one and in small groups. I think that, when you talk about people with felony convictions, they have been, there's been a large stigma around them in general. And so getting them to open up and getting them to talk, and then engage them, the best way that we've been able to do that is in small groups and in communities. There's a guy here, Savvy Shabazz, who is actually working with our local jail to start, hopefully, to do some voter engagement work inside the local jail. So we are hoping that we can see some results from that this November. And so I just encourage folks to keep an eye out on that advocacy. But that is the long, hard work, is educating people about what their rights are, what those restrictions are, and then how they can advocate for themselves. And that's something that we saw in 2020 here with everything that happened with Breonna Taylor, with COVID. We were able to talk to people deeply about their rights to vote. And we launched a campaign. It was called Justice Votes Kentucky. And, we talked about the importance of going to the ballot. And we took a group of people the first day of early voting and we marched to the polls. And it was amazing. And there were some people there that had forgotten that they had even registered to vote during the movement. And they got there and it was the first time that they were able to vote. And so I think that, we have to continue to lay that groundwork, and we will eventually see those blooms happen.
Yeah, Patrice, we know that there are many laws restricting voting, even for the non-incarcerated. So, but there are new laws being drafted all the time. What is the overall messaging here? How do we overcome that to get you have a message to get to folks? How do you overcome that?
I think we overcome that through federal legislation that protects the right to vote across all 50 states, instead of us having to be in reactionary mode all day across all of these different jurisdictions. The Voting Rights Act needs to be fortified and needs to be modernized, and it needs to be universally accepted as the law of the land, so that all of the gamesmanship that we're seeing happen to take voting power away from specific groups of people, right? Not away from people across the board, but to really manipulate and change our system of government is the most important thing, I think.
Yeah, Durrel, David Youngblood writes in, he's watching, he writes in that the buzzword this November is quote unquote swarm the polls. Do you foresee that happening, and two, making the difference that many hope that it would?
Will that happen in November? I mean, there's hope that it will. To tap back into what you were saying earlier about the need for education, that is very, very important. We've seen in places like Houston, Texas, at the Harris County Jail, where community members actually went into the jail and were actually able to go dorm by dorm, cell by cell, and communicate with voters. We've seen in places like Genesee County in Michigan, where formerly incarcerated people who voted in the jail actually have permission to go back, and they have a civic education program that is ongoing, not only around voting time, but even when there's not an election that's coming up. And we've seen things like that really increase participation. And hopefully things like that will continue to go on. At the Sentencing Project, we have a monthly sort of convening where organizers and organizations get together the last Wednesday of every month to talk about what's going on in our respective states and counties. And also, like, there's a lot of cross-pollination that happens there. People find out about new ideas. What's working in your state may also work in another state. And so hopefully November turns into a situation where we are swarming the polls. And hopefully those polls are accessible to everyone who wants to cast a ballot that is supposed to be able to do so.
Yeah, and I think Patrice, he just talked about access. Talk about the importance of that, if you will, because we're talking about it, right? Not everybody has that access.
Yeah, we're seeing so many different developments happening during the pandemic in DC. So these last couple of elections have been the first time that so many people voted by putting their ballot in a ballot box in their local neighborhood, and that there's been discussion of mobile voting and legislation introduced along those lines. And so the more that we can think about how do we make it easy for people to participate, hopefully the more participation we'll see. There's still an extremely low number of people voting in Washington, D.C. And when I think about the margins that have decided certain elections here and the number of people we have serving time in prison, it is not beyond imagination to think that they could make the difference in who's representing them. So access is a big part of this for sure.
Yeah, Representative Herron, we were having some feedback issues there, but hopefully we got it cleared up, because what you were saying was very important and vital to this conversation. But let me ask you this: you know, we talk about these incarcerated individuals and the right, trying to get them the right to vote, access to voting. This is not an issue for Democrats. This is not an issue for Republicans, right? This is an issue. This is a bipartisan. It should be a bipartisan issue, right?
Absolutely, it should be a bipartisan issue. And it's interesting here in Kentucky, a lot of the folks who I have talked to who do not have their rights, they're actually Republicans. And so a lot of people think that they are Democrats, and that's not accurate. And I think the biggest thing, is educating people, not just educating the community, but also educating business leaders, elected officials, all stakeholders, and why this is important. And it's not just about a presidential election or the election at the state house, but it's also about those local elections. Politics are local, and we have to let people know that if they really want the change that they want to see in their community, they have to be engaged with our school board races. They have to be engaged with judges and prosecutors, and the mayors and the city councils. Like, that's where really people will see change in their day-to-day lives. And so that's the message that we're sending out to everyone. And no matter what, if you're a Democrat or Republican or independent, you should have a voice and you should be able to vote.
Yeah, and Douglas, Mr. Douglas, it's Durrel Douglas, so I should say Mr. Douglas. Mr. Douglas, so Sentencing Project obviously has been working diligently on this. Where do we stand at this moment, and what kind of hope can you give folks, or encouragement you can give folks right now?
If you're here at 7:30 Eastern watching this, you are likely the type of person who's very engaged and cares about issues like this. It doesn't take someone else to come up with the idea. Don't assume that your local jail or your local sheriff is making this happen. Get your hands dirty, because that's the way the late Congressman John Lewis would say, make some good trouble. Right. So how I ended up even working with the Sentencing Project is because I reached out and wanted to know what the mechanism looked like for the local jail, found out there wasn't one, and came up with it. You have people like Councilwoman Nikki Nice in Oklahoma City, who's working to do the same thing where she is. And then you have individuals who are making this happen where they are. And so I would encourage folks to read the report. There are recommendations there to get this going in your respective counties and cities. and go to the sentencingproject.org. You can click there and you can actually download it. It's Voting in Jails, Advocacy Strategies to Unlock the Vote. It's sort of a starting point for entities, organizations, or organizers that want to help expand democracy.
Fantastic. And Patrice Sulton, we'll conclude with you. Pretty much the same question. The DC Justice Lab, what encouragement can you offer at this moment? And is there any information you can give, a website or anything where people can go to for more information is what I'm getting at there?
Sure. So, I mean, to learn more about our Restore the Vote bill, you can see actually Councilmember Robert White's opinion editorial from 2019 really makes the case for why we made those changes here. And I'm mostly encouraged by the people who are on my screen, not just to make sure people understand that they should be voting, but they should be running, right? What would it look like if all of the state houses across the country were really representative of the people who live there and included people who have served time and who have felony convictions in a representative way? I think we'd all be better off. We'd all be a whole lot safer. And I think a lot of our other laws would be better as well.
Patrice, real quick, you earlier alluded to an election in Washington, D.C., where the individual was in jail and he won.
Yes, that's correct. We have advisory neighborhood commissions here, and there is a single member district that an organization called Neighbors for Justice was really involved in making sure had the same representation as any other jurisdiction that would have 1,500 people in a single building. And he ran to represent that jurisdiction, and he now does represent it as their commissioner, and he's released from jail after serving, I believe it was 26 or 27 years.
Wow.
And is doing a remarkable job as a commissioner, of course.
That is quite the story right there. Patrice Sulton of the DC Justice Lab, Kentucky State Rep Keturah, Herron, and Jail-Based Voter Initiative organizer at the Sentencing Project, Durrel Douglas. We certainly thank you for bringing this valuable information to the Black press and let it be known this morning. Thanks for watching, everybody. We will see you tomorrow.